Montana Territory, August 1876. The sun was dropping low behind the Bitterroot Mountains when Juliet Danner stepped off the stagecoach in the dust-choked street of Garnet. She stood a full head taller than every woman and most men watching her from the boardwalk. Her boots hit the dirt with a solid thud, her spine straight, even though she could feel their stares like heat on her skin. "You sure there ain't some mistake, miss?" the station master asked, tilting his hat back as he looked up at her. "You travelin' alone?" "I am," she said, her voice steady. "I have work lined up. Housekeeping for the Harrow family." The man gave a short nod, but his eyes lingered too long. Juliet had grown used to that. At 23, she had heard it all: too tall, too strange, too much. Her last employer in Kansas tossed her out after his eldest son made the mistake of calling her beautiful in front of his mother. Juliet had packed her trunk, lifted it herself, and left without a word. She had nowhere left to go but west. She had barely stepped onto the porch of the Harrow home when Mrs. Harrow opened the door, eyes wide with surprise that flickered quickly into discomfort. "You're Miss Danner?" "Yes, ma'am." "You're very tall." Juliet waited. It always followed. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding," Mrs. Harrow said. "We already hired someone else." Juliet stood still. "But the letter, I'm sorry." The door shut with a soft final click. Juliet stood there a moment longer, then turned and walked back into the street. Her trunk sat near the stage depot, untouched. She did not move to pick it up. A voice called out from the far end of the street. "Mom? You lookin' for somewhere to stay?" She turned. A man walked toward her, tall himself, though not quite her height, with dust on his boots and sun on his skin. He wore a worn hat and a tan shirt rolled to the elbows, arms marked from work and weather. His eyes were green as pine needles and steady as the ground. "Name's Kade Sutton," he said. "I've got a cabin up on the ridge. Bit of a ride, but I got a spare room. Not much, but it's clean. You're welcome to it." Juliet narrowed her eyes. "Why would you offer that to a stranger?" He shrugged. "Because I watched you get turned out for no decent reason. And where I come from, you do not leave a woman on the street." Juliet looked toward her trunk, then back at him. "You can carry that yourself?" "I can." He lifted it without showing the strain, then nodded toward the horses tied just down the road. "You ride? Well enough." They rode in silence for a time, the trail winding up into the hills where the trees grew thick and the air cooled. His cabin sat nestled beneath a stand of tall pines, a small barn nearby with 2 horses and a cow. The land stretched quiet and gold around them. Kade held the door open. "You want to wash up? There's a pump out back. I'll get you a plate of stew." She hesitated in the doorway. "You are not expecting anything in return, are you?" He looked her dead in the eye. "No." "You sleep safe under my roof or not at all. That is your choice." Juliet stepped inside. That night, she sat across from him at a rough-hewn table, eating stew that tasted better than anything she had had in weeks. He did not ask questions. He did not treat her like something to pity. When she rose to help with dishes, he let her. The next morning, she woke early and was already splitting kindling when he came out of the barn. He paused, watching her line up the axe with practiced care. "You ever done ranch work?" Juliet pulled her hair back with a tie of leather. "I can learn." For the next week, she did everything he did: feeding stock, repairing fence, cleaning tack. She worked hard and quiet, and Kade never once made her feel small for being different. She caught him watching her once, while she led his younger horse around the paddock, and his eyes were not mocking. They were something else. One evening, after a long day mending fence in the sun, they sat on the porch with tin mugs of coffee. "You always been out here alone?" she asked.
3 years now, he said.
"Had a brother. Lost him in the war.
Folks passed long before that.
Left Missouri and never looked back." Juliet was quiet a moment. "I was engaged once," she said. "He called it off 2 weeks before the wedding." said he could not stand the way I made him feel. Small. Kade looked over at her. He was the one who was small. She turned to him, something tight in her chest. You do not look at me like I am a mistake. That is because you are not. The words hung there between them, thick with something unspoken. The next afternoon, a storm rolled in sharp and fast. They were out in the south pasture when the thunder hit. Juliet slipped in the mud, and Kade caught her by the waist, holding her steady. Her breath caught. So did his. You all right? He asked, his voice rough. She nodded, rain sliding down her cheek. He did not let go right away. That night, they sat closer on the porch. He reached out and took her hand without asking. She let him. Neither of them spoke of it, but they did not let go for a long time. By the end of that second week, Juliet had taken to watching the trail from the porch in the evenings, like she was waiting for something. Do you want to stay? Kade asked her one night, his voice low. She looked at him, searching his face. Do you want me to? He nodded. I do. She stepped closer, until there was no space between them. I have never belonged anywhere, she said. You do here, he said, his hand rising to rest against her cheek. With me. And for the first time in her life, she believed it. By mid-September, the air shifted. Mornings came edged with frost, and the aspens along the creek began to yellow. Juliet rose before the sun now, her hands rougher than they'd ever been, her shoulders strong from hauling water and hauling feed. She had stopped keeping track of the days, though she still marked each Sunday by scrubbing the floors and braiding her hair clean and tight. Kade had given her the south end of the garden to manage. She planted late beans and helped thin the carrots, sometimes humming under her breath, not knowing he could hear her through the open barn doors. He didn't say anything about it, but he lingered longer in the loft when she sang, sitting still in the hay with his elbows on his knees. One afternoon, he brought down a stack of old ledgers and set them on the table. Reckon I could use an extra set of eyes on these. Juliet flipped one open. You keep books? Try to. My brother was the one with the head for figures. I do what I can. She ran her fingers down a column of tallies. This is off. You counted the same sale twice. Kade leaned over her shoulder. You sure? She nodded. You sold the same saddle to two different names. He let out a long breath. That explains the argument with the Dobbins boy. Thought he was just being ornery. Juliet smiled, faint and quick. You want me to help keep track of these? If you've got the patience for it. She didn't answer, just flipped to the next page and started sorting. He watched her a moment, then went to stoke the stove. That night, after the books were put away, they sat outside with a lantern between them. The wind had turned, pushing down from the north, and the trees whispered close. Kade shifted, resting his forearms on his knees. You ever think about where you'd be if you hadn't come this way? Juliet looked toward the tree line. Sometimes. But I don't dwell on it. There wasn't anything worth staying for. He nodded once, then hesitated. I figure you've got your share of folks who let you down. I have, she said, but none of them are here. He looked over at her, quiet for a long moment. You've changed the way this place feels. How so? It used to be just land and work. Now it feels like something I might want to keep. She turned toward him fully, her expression unreadable in the low light. You don't say things you don't mean.
No.
I don't. Juliet stood then, slow and deliberate, and stepped down from the porch. She walked out into the grass, letting the chill settle over her. The stars were sharp above, the kind that made the world feel endless. Kade joined her a few minutes later, his steps careful on the frost-bitten grass. You think I'm strange? She asked. No, he said. I think you're rare. She looked up at him, her face shadowed. I'm used to not being wanted. You're wanted here. She didn't answer, but she didn't step away when he reached for her hand, either. The next day, she started drawing a map of the property by hand. She used an old flour sack and a lump of charcoal, sketching out the east fence line and the rise behind the barn. Kade glanced at it over her shoulder as he passed. "What's that for?" "I like to know where I am." He pointed to a mark she'd made near the stream. "That's where the wild roses grow. My brother used to trap mink down there." Juliet shaded the area in, then kept drawing. That night, she tacked the finished map to the inside of the barn wall. Kade didn't say anything, but he ran his fingers across the edge of it once, like it meant something to him. Later that week, they rode into town together for supplies. The general store was quiet, but the shopkeeper's daughter narrowed her eyes at Juliet from behind the counter. Kade stepped closer without making a show of it, his hand brushing Juliet's spine as they paid. On the way home, he didn't mention it. Instead, he said, "You ever think about building something permanent?" She looked over at him, her brow drawn. "You mean a home?" "Something like that." Juliet didn't answer right away. She watched the pine trees pass by, remembered how it felt to be turned away without cause. Then she said, "I think I'd like to build something that can't be taken from me." Kade nodded once. "Then we'll build it." They didn't speak the rest of the ride, but when they reached the cabin, Juliet didn't go inside. She stood by the fence instead, watching the sky darken behind the ridge. Kade came to stand beside her. "You cold?" "No," he waited, then said, "You don't have to stay here, because you've got nowhere else." "I'm staying because I want to," she said. He reached up, brushing a strand of hair from her temple. "Then I'll make sure this place is yours, too." She closed her eyes for a moment, then leaned into his hand. And for the first time, the weight she'd carried for years began to shift. By the time September tilted into October, Juliet had begun keeping her boots by the door and her gloves tucked into the crook of the porch rail. She knew which floorboards creaked, which cupboards stuck, and how the light changed in the sitting room just before evening settled. She'd started baking bread without needing to ask where the flour was kept, and when Kade built a second shelf above the stove, she filled it with dried sage and pennyroyal she'd gathered herself. One morning, she was mending the seam of her work shirt when Kade came in from the barn with a folded paper in his hand. "Letter from Helena," he said, laying it on the table. Juliet brushed the thread between her fingers. "From someone you know?" "Cattle buyers," he said. "They're holding a meet in a week. Folks from as far as Idaho coming through." She set her needle aside. "You going?" "I was thinking we could both go. It's a 2-day ride. There's room in the cart." Juliet studied him. "You planning to sell stock?" "Not this year. But I want to see what they're asking and who's trading." She nodded slowly. "I'll pack what we need." On the trail, the weather turned colder. Juliet kept her coat collar up and her hat low, the wind biting harder as they climbed toward the pass. The wagon they took was slow, but steady. They camped that night near a stand of cottonwoods, the ground covered in brittle leaves. Juliet stirred the fire while Kade unrolled the bedrolls. She didn't speak until he settled beside her, knees drawn. "Do you ever think about what kind of life you'll have in 10 years?" she asked. He poked at the coals. "I used to think I wouldn't have one. Now I think I just want it to be quiet, steady, with someone who doesn't flinch when things get hard." Juliet pressed her palms near the heat. "I used to believe I'd always be living in someone else's spare room. That's what came of me being different. I was never someone to build a life with, just pass through." Kade didn't look away from the fire. "You're not passing through here." They didn't touch, but he shifted closer, and she didn't move away. When she finally lay down, it was near enough to hear his breathing and feel the warmth of him through the chill. Helena was louder than Juliet expected. Wagons and horses filled the roadways, and smoke curled from every chimney. They stayed at a boarding house on the edge of town, where the floors slanted and the walls were thin. Kade left early the next morning to walk the yards, and Juliet wandered the alleys behind the shops, drawn to the strange rhythm of the place. Near the hardware store, she found a woman her age selling pressed flowers folded into paper bookmarks. The woman offered her one for free, saying it was too bent for market. Juliet tucked it into her coat pocket. That evening, she joined Kade at the stock tents. He stood with his arms folded, watching two buyers haggle over a pair of yearlings. "You learn anything?" she asked. He nodded. "Prices are high. They're short on feed south of here." She glanced around. "You thinking of expanding?" "Eventually, when the land's ready." As they walked back toward the boarding house, Kade paused at a blacksmith stall. He picked up a simple iron horseshoe and turned it over in his hands. "Superstition?" she asked, eyeing the worn metal. "Habit. My brother used to nail one above every stall." Juliet reached for it, brushing his fingers as she took it. "Then we'll hang it over the barn door when we're home." He smiled, a quiet flicker at the corner of his mouth, and nodded. That night, in the narrow room with the draft under the door, Juliet stood by the window, looking out over the oil lamps glowing in the street. Kade sat at the edge of the bed, unlacing his boots. "You all right?" She turned. "I never imagined sharing a roof with someone wouldn't feel like a burden." He looked up at her. "You're not one. I hope you know that." Juliet crossed the room, her hands loose at her sides. "When I think about 10 years from now, I see a house with a porch. I see early mornings and worn gloves. I see you." Kade stood slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "Then let's build it." She reached up, laying her hand at the base of his throat. "You sure?" "More than I've ever been." They didn't rush. He held her like she might slip through his hands if he wasn't careful. And for the first time, Juliet let herself be held without bracing for the fall. When they returned to the ranch, the trees had dropped most of their leaves, and the wind had changed again. Juliet carried the horseshoe in her coat pocket and handed it to Kade before they reached the barn. He nailed it above the door without a word. When he stepped down, he turned to her. "I want you to have your name on this land someday." She tilted her head. "You planning to carve it into the fence?" "No," he said. "I'm planning to take your hand and make it yours in every way." Juliet looked at him, the wind tugging at her coat. "Then say it plain." He did. And she said yes. Not because she was grateful, not because she had nowhere else, but because this man, this place, this quiet life they'd begun to shape together, it was finally hers as much as his. And she had never been more certain. The weather held dry well into October. Each morning, the frost lingered longer across the fields, and the air carried a sharper quiet. Juliet had started wearing a scarf at dawn, and when she lit the stove, her breath still showed in the cabin's shadows. Kade had begun cutting boards for a new lean-to off the east side of the barn. He didn't say what it was for, and she didn't press him. But she noticed he measured twice now instead of once, and checked the angles again before hammering. It was the kind of care a man gave to something he wanted to last. One afternoon, Juliet rode out along the north fence to check the line, a small hammer and pouch of nails strapped to her saddle. She had come to know the land by touch, the way it sloped near the creek, the feel of the rocky rise by the cottonwood bend. As she dismounted to fix a loose post, she spotted a flicker of movement up the ridge. A rider. She straightened slowly, hand skimming the edge of her coat. The man was older, his horse thin and long-legged. He reined in a distance off and lifted a hand. "You the ones working this spread now?" he called. Juliet nodded once. "We are." He rode closer, but kept a respectful space. "Name's Elias Traeger. I used to run cattle east of here. For the war. Thought I'd come see if the land still knew me." Juliet watched him, eyes steady. "It's been quiet out here." "Not quiet enough," Elias said, glancing toward the tree line. "Saw smoke beyond the ridge. Could be trappers. Could be less honest men." Juliet tightened the strap of her glove. "You see how many?" "2, maybe 3. Could be nothing." but I'd keep your doors bolted come dusk." He tipped his hat and turned back toward the trees. Juliet watched until he disappeared, then swung into the saddle and rode hard for home. When she reached the cabin, Kade was in the barn loft, stacking hay. She didn't call out, just stepped inside and waited until he noticed her. "There's trouble," she said as he climbed down. A man rode through, said he saw fires past the ridge. Kade wiped his hands on a cloth. Did he give a name? Traeger. Rode an old bay. Wore a Union coat. Kade nodded. He's real. Used to trap this land before it turned to grazing. Don't think he'd lie. Juliet leaned against the post. He said to lock up tight. We will. That night, Kade bolted the door himself and checked the rifle over the mantel. Juliet didn't ask if he'd used it before. She only loaded shells into the drawer and made sure the lamp oil was full. They didn't speak of fear aloud, but she saw it in the way he moved quieter, slower, as if listening with his whole body. In the early hours, she woke to the sound of boots on the porch. Kade was already on his feet, rifle in hand. He moved to the door and waited. A single knock came, low and firm. "Name yourself," Kade said. A voice came through the wood. "Traeger." "Just me." Juliet opened the bolt. The older man stepped inside, hat in hand. "I came back because I thought you ought to know. Saw their camp tonight. 3 men, and not the kind who trade furs." Kade's jaw tightened. "How close?" "Half a mile. Maybe less. They've got mules and a rifle apiece." Juliet moved to the window. "You think they'll come for the stock?" "If they think it's unguarded." Kade nodded once. "Then we'll let them see it's not." They took turns keeping watch through the night, Juliet wrapped in her coat by the window, Kade on the porch with the rifle across his knees. Traeger stayed by the barn, a weathered presence that made the darkness feel less hollow. Morning came cold and still. The men were gone. No tracks near the fence, no sign of fire. But the warning had settled deep. After Traeger rode on, Kade came in and set the rifle beside the door. "I've been thinking," he said, voice low. "We should put up a second door on the barn. Bar it from inside." Juliet nodded. "And double the fence near the paddock. They'll come again, if not this year then next." He looked at her then, something soft behind the fatigue. "You didn't flinch," he said. "I don't know how to anymore." He stepped close, hand brushing the edge of her sleeve. "You're not just strong. You're steady." She laid her fingers against his collarbone, feeling the heat of him through the wool. "That's what you needed, isn't it?" "I didn't know I did," he said. "Until you." She leaned in, resting her forehead against his. "Then let's keep building. Make this place more than safe, make it ours." He kissed her without rush, the kind of kiss that settled deep, like earth warmed by sun. When they pulled apart, the room felt changed, like something in it had finally clicked into place. By week's end, they'd framed the extra door and started laying stones for a smokehouse near the tree line. Juliet worked with her sleeves rolled and her hair tied back in a kerchief, her cheeks ruddy from the cold. Kade carved a weather vane from scrap iron and mounted it above the barn. No more strangers came. The leaves gave up their color one by one, and the sky turned silver with the promise of snow. Inside the cabin, Juliet had hung the pressed flower from Helena on the wall above the hearth. It had faded to a pale rust red, but it remained intact. One evening, as wind curled around the corners of the roof, Kade set a small wooden box on the table. "I made this," he said, "for your books. Or whatever you want to keep." She opened it slow. The inside was lined with a square of calico. She ran her fingers over the edge, then looked at him. "You keep giving me pieces of this place." He held her gaze. "Because I want every part of it to have you in it." She reached for him then, and he didn't hesitate. They stood there, hands linked, the fire low behind them, and the wind outside no longer sounded like something to fear. Not anymore. The first snow fell the second week of November, soft and early, like winter was just checking its footing. It didn't stick, but it dusted the roof and softened the ground enough to make the barn door drag. Juliet wedged a flat stone under the hinge and made a note to chisel the sill before the next storm. Inside the cabin, Kade was oiling the leather harnesses by the stove, his sleeves pushed high on his forearms. Juliet unwrapped a bundle of cured herbs and hung it from the crossbeam over the hearth. The air filled with sharp mint and faint wild lavender, and she nodded once, satisfied. "You've been quiet today," Kade said, not looking up. "I found something in the bottom drawer," Juliet said. "Old letters. Your brother's." Kade set the harness aside and leaned back, his hands resting on his thighs. "I forgot those were still in there." She walked over and set them on the table. "He wrote about you a great deal. Said you were good with animals and better with silence than folks." "He exaggerated," Kade said, glancing at the yellowed pages. "No," Juliet said. "He wrote like someone who knew you fully. That kind of knowing doesn't lie." Kade rubbed his jaw. "I kept them to remember what mattered. Guess I forgot how much he saw." Juliet slid into the chair across from him. "He was proud of the man you were already becoming. That's rare." Kade didn't answer at first. Then he said, "You're the only person I've met since who makes me feel like I can still be that man." Juliet folded the letters back into the twine and set them aside. "Then he'd be glad I came." That night, wind pushed hard against the cabin walls. The fire popped in short bursts, and Juliet took down the quilt she'd been piecing together for weeks. Strips of old shirts, wool from a worn coat, the edge of a curtain no longer needed. She spread it over their bed without comment. Kade rested his hand on the frame, watching her smooth the corners. "You stitched our initials in the center." "I did." He touched the thread with his thumb. "I never thought I'd have a home again." "Not really." She looked up, her face calm but clear. "You do now. And so do I." The next morning, they rode out to the South Ridge. Snow had melted into the soil, leaving it dark and soft. Kade dismounted and knelt near the ground. "This is where I'd want to build it," he said. Juliet stayed atop her mare, watching the horizon. "You mean the house?" He nodded. "Something more than the cabin. A place with a kitchen big enough for you to dry 10 bundles of herbs without ducking. A bedroom that doesn't creak when I roll over." She smiled faintly. "You think we'll need a second room?" His eyes lifted to hers. Eventually, Juliet dismounted and walked to where he knelt. Her boots sank slightly into the softened earth. "Then let's start planning it. If the spring's dry, we can break ground before first thaw." They stood there, just looking at the space. A hawk circled overhead, slow and sure. Later, back at the barn, Juliet opened the tack chest and pulled out a small wooden box wrapped in linen. She handed it to him without a word. Kade unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a pair of carved wedding bands, simple and unpolished. "I made them from the cherrywood beam we pulled from the old corral," she said. "It was the strongest piece." He turned one in his hand. "You think of everything." "I think of you," she said. He slid the larger ring onto his left hand, then took hers and fitted the second one over her knuckle, slow and sure. It didn't slip, it settled. The rest of November passed in a kind of quiet work that never felt like labor. They reinforced the barn rafters, added a stone lip to the hearth, and hung dried apples from strings across the kitchen window. Juliet began keeping a small ledger of their stores, and Kade drew a rough sketch of the future house on the back of an unused feed bill. One morning, as they cleared the last of the root cellar, Kade paused and looked up from his work. "I want to take your name to the land office come spring. Not just as wife, but as partner." Juliet met his gaze fully. "Then do it. I'll stand beside you and sign." That night, they sat on the porch beneath heavy blankets, watching the stars come out one by one. You ever think you have this? He asked. No, she said, resting her head against his shoulder. But now I can't imagine anything else. He kissed her temple, slow and warm. We'll have the house. Maybe a child, if we're lucky. And if not, she asked, her voice quiet. Kade laced his fingers through hers. Then we'll have this. And that's more than enough. The first true snow came in December. It blanketed the hills and softened the world until even the trees seemed to whisper less. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low and steady, and the quilt on their bed held heat like a promise. They woke each morning tangled together, the light filtering through frost-laced windows. There were fences left to mend and seed to order, but the days stretched calmly, filled with work that bore no fear. One Sunday, Juliet stood in the doorway, watching Kade adjust the new iron latch he'd made to keep the barn door from dragging. She turned back inside, picked up a scrap of parchment, and began to write just a few lines. Her handwriting was steady now, sure. She wrote of the land, of the man who'd offered her a place when she had none, of the way quiet could mean safety instead of loneliness. She folded the paper and tucked it into a book she kept beside the bed. Kade came in, his cheeks flushed from cold. Warm enough in here? Plenty, she said, reaching for his hand. He set his gloves on the stove rail and pulled her close. I want every winter to be like this. It will be, she said, resting her head against his chest. As long as we keep choosing each other. And they did, day after day. Through snow and thaw, through planting and harvest, through the long hush of winter and the quiet green of new spring. They built the new house the following summer, just where they'd planned. It was modest, strong, with wide eaves and a porch that faced the ridge. Juliet dried herbs in the kitchen window and kept her ledger tucked in a drawer beside the flower. Kade built her a writing desk from pine and carved her name into the back panel. By the second harvest, the house had settled into the earth like it had always belonged there. And so had they. Their life stretched long and full, quiet, yes, but never empty. And in that quiet, they found the kind of love that doesn't need speaking to be known. The kind that holds. They grew old together beneath that ridge, side by side. And they were never alone again.